This Airbus A330 has just lifted off into the night sky, but within seconds the pilots realize something is terribly wrong. None of their airspeed indicators are giving reliable information. Without airspeed, flying a large jet becomes one of the most difficult challenges a crew can face. What caused this situation is not a simple technical failure, but a chain of small human mistakes that lined up perfectly. This story is a real-life example of how aviation safety barriers can slowly break down one by one. In aviation, safety is built on shared responsibility. Ground staff, engineers, cabin crew, pilots, and air traffic controllers all have clearly defined roles. When each person does their job correctly, accidents are prevented long before they can happen. But when assumptions replace communication, even a tiny threat can grow into a serious incident. In this case, the threat was something almost invisible, a small insect known as a mud wasp. These wasps are common in Australia, especially around Brisbane. They like to build nests in small, narrow holes, and modern aircraft have plenty of those. One of their favorite places is the pitot tube. Pitot tubes are critical sensors mounted on the nose of an aircraft. They measure airflow, which allows the flight computers to calculate airspeed. To protect them on the ground, bright red pitot covers can be installed. These covers must always be removed before flight. At Brisbane Airport, mud wasps had become such a serious problem that airlines were warned to use pitot covers during longer ground stops. Malaysian Airlines had recently restarted operations to Brisbane, but vital information about these covers never fully reached everyone who needed to know. That communication gap would soon prove to be dangerous. The incident began on the evening of 18th July 2018. At around 8:20 p.m. local time, the Airbus A330 arrived at Brisbane Airport after a routine flight. Passengers disembarked normally, and the aircraft was scheduled to remain at the gate for about 3 hours before operating a return flight to Kuala Lumpur. A Malaysian Airlines line maintenance engineer had flown in specifically to oversee the turnaround. Since he was not based in Brisbane, he had limited equipment and relied on local assistance. About 25 minutes after arrival, a locally based assistant engineer approached the aircraft carrying 3 pitot tube covers, following airport recommendations. Using mobile steps, the assistant engineer installed the covers on all 3 pitot probes on the nose of the aircraft. Once finished, he went to the cockpit and informed the line engineer that the covers had been fitted. However, the comment was either missed or misunderstood. The line engineer did not respond and made no entry in the technical log. Shortly after, both engineers left the cockpit to continue their tasks on the apron. The line engineer began his external walk-around inspection. CCTV footage later showed him shining a flashlight directly at the pitot probes. He noticed the covers but felt confused. He had not requested them and was unaware of the mud wasp issue at Brisbane. He made a mental note to ask for their removal later and continued his inspection. Unfortunately, distractions soon followed. Fueling began, oil servicing was required, and multiple tasks demanded his attention. When the assistant engineer returned, the focus shifted entirely to refueling operations. The pitot covers were forgotten. This moment marked another hole opening in the safety system. A simple reminder, a written note, or a clear handover could have stopped everything right here. Instead, the aircraft continued preparing for departure, with its most critical sensors still blocked. As the turnaround continued, The flight crew for the return journey arrived at the aircraft. The captain and first officer were both experienced pilots, though their backgrounds were different. The captain had thousands of flight hours but was relatively new to the Airbus A330. The first officer, on the other hand, had extensive experience on this exact aircraft type. They agreed that the first officer would be the pilot flying, while the captain would act as pilot monitoring. As part of standard procedure, the captain was responsible for performing the external pre-flight walkaround inspection. By this time, the line maintenance engineer had completed his tasks and assumed that the assistant engineer would handle the final checks during pushback. This assumption was never confirmed. After finishing paperwork and speaking briefly with the pilots, the line engineer boarded the aircraft as a passenger for the flight home. At approximately 10:54 p.m., the captain exited the cockpit to perform his walkaround. CCTV footage later revealed that this inspection was unusually brief. He looked toward the left side of the aircraft nose, then moved on quickly. He did not fully check the right side, and the pitot covers, bright red with warning streamers, went unnoticed. This failure can be explained by a psychological effect known as inattentional blindness. When a person expects to see a normal situation, unexpected objects can be missed entirely even when they are in plain sight. Since the captain did not expect pitot covers on a routine turnaround, his brain simply filtered them out. After returning to the cockpit, the crew completed their pre-flight setup. Performance calculations were entered, takeoff speeds were confirmed, and checklists were read. When the checklist item gear pins and covers was called, the response was removed. In reality, no pitot covers were present in the cockpit. They were rarely used by the airline, and their absence did not raise concern. The final opportunity to stop the incident came during the pushback phase. At Brisbane Airport, a leading hand is responsible for supervising the departure, including a final external inspection before pushback. This check is meant to confirm that all panels are closed and that no covers or equipment remain on the aircraft. On this night, Malasian Airlines had recently changed their ground handling provider. The assigned leading hand was unsure whether he was fully trained for the final walkaround procedure. To be safe, he asked another leading hand, who was busy with a different aircraft, to assist. Here is where another assumption crept in. The first leading hand believed the second person would perform the final inspection. The second leading hand assumed it had already been done. As a result, no one completed the critical last walkaround. When the flight crew requested confirmation that all external checks were complete, the response was confident and immediate. Everything was clear and the aircraft was ready for pushback. The tug began to move the aircraft away from the gate. From the pushback truck, the pitot covers were impossible to see. The leading hand walking beside the aircraft was focused on engine starts and obstacle clearance, not on the nose of the aircraft. One by one, the last safety barriers failed. By the time the aircraft taxied toward the runway, 4 separate inspections had missed the same problem. The pitot probes essential for airspeed information were still completely blocked. Moments later, the Airbus A330 lined up on runway 01 for departure. The night was calm, with almost no wind. Nothing suggested that the takeoff would be anything but routine. Then the throttles were advanced. As the Airbus A330 accelerated down the runway, everything initially felt normal. The engines produced full thrust, and the aircraft began its takeoff roll smoothly. But as the speed increased, something was clearly wrong. Normally, airspeed indicators begin to come alive around 30 knots. This time, nothing happened. At 50 knots, red warning flags suddenly appeared on both pilots' primary flight displays. The aircraft's systems had detected a major disagreement between ground speed and airspeed data. The captain immediately sensed danger and called out, "Speed, speed." His breathing became faster, a clear sign of rising stress. Almost at the same moment, an unrelated radio transmission from air traffic control cut through the cockpit, adding distraction at the worst possible time. Seconds later, the captain called 100 knots based on the ground speed display. This callout marked the transition from low-speed to high-speed regime, a critical moment. Below 100 knots, pilots are trained to reject the takeoff for almost any abnormality. Above it, they are expected to continue unless the aircraft is clearly unsafe to fly. The mixed messages caused confusion. The first officer hesitated. The aircraft continued accelerating rapidly toward decision speed. Instead of rejecting the takeoff, the crew's focus shifted to diagnosing the problem. The first officer suggested switching to another air data reference system, hoping to restore airspeed information. This showed good technical knowledge, but the timing was wrong. Troubleshooting should never replace a reject decision while runway remained. Within seconds, the aircraft passed V1 and then rotation speed. With no reliable airspeed available, the first officer rotated the aircraft using ground speed as a reference. The Airbus A330 lifted off into the night sky already in a highly abnormal condition. Just after liftoff, warning tones filled the cockpit. A master caution illuminated, followed by an ECAM message indicating the autothrust system had disconnected. The first officer called it out. The captain responded calmly with standard commands, positive rate. Gear up. The landing gear was retracted, but the situation was far from stable. All airspeed displays showed unreliable information. Briefly, small speed values appeared, but they never rose above around 50 knots. This was caused by pitot heating partially melting the covers, allowing limited airflow, far from accurate. Because the aircraft believed its speed was extremely low, flight control protections were reduced. The Airbus automatically downgraded from normal law to alternate law, removing several safety protections pilots normally rely on. The first officer pitched the aircraft to about 13 degrees nose up and held takeoff thrust. However, the standard memory actions for unreliable airspeed, 15 degrees pitch and full thrust were not applied. The crew was still trying to understand the situation. At 300 feet, the first officer asked whether the captain had switched air data systems. The switch was made, but nothing changed. All pitot probes were blocked, so no system could provide valid airspeed. As the aircraft climbed through 1,000 feet, thrust was reduced and pitch was lowered. The crew began working through ECAM messages, but the workload was intense. At 1,500 feet, another warning confirmed they were in alternate law. Air traffic control called to transfer them to departure frequency. Amid the confusion, the first officer suggested declaring a PAN, an urgency call. The captain agreed. The aircraft was now climbing without reliable airspeed, degraded flight controls, and rising pressure on the crew. The first PAN call went unheard. Air traffic control believed the crew had already switched frequencies, while the pilots thought they had communicated the urgency. After a brief delay, the first officer repeated the PAN call on the correct frequency. This time, it was received. Immediately, the tone of the operation changed. Air traffic control provided full priority handling and cleared the aircraft to climb to 10,000 feet. The crew finally had the breathing room they desperately needed. At around 5,800 feet, the captain began working through the non-normal checklist for unreliable airspeed. The autopilot could not be engaged, so the first officer continued flying manually using pitch, thrust, and ground speed cues to maintain safe flight. As they climbed, the crew realized how unusual the situation truly was. All three air data reference units appeared to be unreliable. This was extremely rare. To confirm, the captain reviewed the checklist again. The procedure instructed them to switch all air data systems off. This was a serious decision, because once done in flight, they could not be reactivated until landing. After careful discussion, the crew agreed and turned all three systems off. This action activated a special Airbus feature known as the backup speed scale. Instead of showing exact airspeed, it displayed a safe performance envelope based on pitch and thrust. It was not perfect, but it was usable. The crew now had a way to manage the aircraft safely. However, this mode came with limitations. Speed brakes could not be used. Landing gear would require gravity extension. Nose wheel steering would be unavailable after touchdown. Every decision from this point forward would need careful planning. With the situation stabilized, the crew began planning the rest of the flight. They coordinated closely with air traffic control, requesting extended vectors to the east of Brisbane while they worked through the remaining procedures. The pilots discussed the consequences of flying without air data. Pressurization would have to be managed manually. Speed brakes were off limits. The landing gear would need to be lowered using gravity, which meant the gear doors would not fully retract. After landing, the aircraft would be unable to taxi and would need to be towed from the runway. Air traffic control relayed these needs to airport operations, ensuring emergency services and a tug would be ready. The crew then made a key decision. They would return to Brisbane and land on the same runway they had departed from. This meant landing slightly overweight, but performance calculations confirmed it was within safe limits. The cabin crew was informed. Passengers were told the aircraft would return as a precaution and that the landing would be normal. Inside the cockpit, discipline and teamwork were now at their highest level. Another important discussion followed: who would land the aircraft? Company procedures normally required the captain to land in non-normal situations. But the first officer had significantly more experience on the A330 and had been flying the aircraft smoothly throughout the emergency. After careful consideration, they agreed the first officer would continue as pilot flying. At 11,000 feet, the aircraft was fully configured for the approach phase. The stress had not disappeared, but control had been regained. Now, everything depended on a single, precise landing. The descent began just before midnight. Using the backup speed scale, the captain carefully guided the first officer through every configuration change. For each step, thrust reduction, pitch adjustment, and flap extension, the captain pre-read the required settings to stay within the safe flight envelope. Air traffic control continuously provided ground speed updates, giving the crew another vital reference. The aircraft intercepted the ILS localizer at about 20 miles from the runway. As the glide slope came alive, the workload increased, but the cockpit remained calm and methodical. Because speed brakes were unavailable, energy management had to be precise. Small thrust changes replaced what would normally be handled automatically. The gravity extension of the landing gear caused additional drag, which had to be anticipated carefully. As they switched to tower frequency, the controller continued providing ground speed information. The first officer followed the guidance perfectly, maintaining stable pitch and thrust all the way down final. At 12:33 a.m., the Airbus A330 crossed the runway threshold. Touchdown occurred squarely within the touchdown zone at approximately 152 knots ground speed. The landing was firm but controlled. Without nose wheel steering, the aircraft rolled straight ahead until it came to a complete stop about 1,600 meters before the end of the runway. A tug was already waiting. There were no injuries. The only damage was minor scraping on the landing gear doors, caused by the gravity extension combined with the overweight landing. The hardest part was over. Once the aircraft was secured on the runway, the pilots finally had time to breathe. A tug towed the Airbus A330 back to the stand, where maintenance teams were already waiting. Only then did the full picture begin to emerge. Inside the cockpit, the line maintenance engineer was called forward. As the pilots explained the unreliable airspeed event, his memory clicked instantly. He remembered seeing the pitot covers during his walk-around and realizing too late that they had never been removed. The investigation that followed revealed how a series of small, reasonable assumptions had combined into a serious incident. Information about mud wasp activity had not been effectively shared. The fitting of pitot covers was never recorded in the technical log. Multiple inspections relied on expectation rather than confirmation. Checklists were answered from habit instead of verification. Each safety layer failed quietly. The final report criticized the airline's risk assessment process and highlighted weaknesses in communication, training, and procedural discipline. As a result, several changes were recommended. Pitot cover installation must always be logged, pilots must receive clearer guidance on rejecting takeoffs for unreliable airspeed, and manufacturers should improve cockpit alerts for airspeed failures. Despite everything, this story is also about professionalism. Once airborne, the crew worked as a team, managed workload effectively, communicated clearly, and made smart decisions under pressure. Their actions prevented what could have become a catastrophe. This incident is a powerful reminder that in aviation, accidents are rarely caused by a single mistake. They happen when many small errors align, and when assumptions replace verification. Sometimes, even a tiny insect can bring a wide-body aircraft to the edge.